So today, we're going to unpack the incredible 500-year story of the Portuguese Empire. You have to wonder, right? How did this tiny kingdom, kind of tucked away on the edge of Europe, become a global superpower that literally redrew the map of the world? It is a wild story of ambition, world-changing discovery, and a legacy that, you'll see, is still with us today. Okay, take a look at this. These lines, they're the shipping lanes that power our world right now. All the stuff you own, a lot of it traveled along these routes. But here's the crazy part. Most of these oceanic highways were first charted over 5 centuries ago, not by some huge superpower, but by the small nation of Portugal at a time when most of the ocean was just a big, scary blank space on the map. So that's the big question, isn't it? How on earth did they do it? How did this little kingdom manage to build an empire that would connect the entire globe and completely change the course of history? Well, let's dive in and find out. So our story really kicks off right after a long, grueling war. See, Portugal had finally secured its land borders against its much bigger neighbor Spain. And that meant there was really nowhere to expand, but out to sea. It wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. And it was that push that would launch an incredible age of exploration. And they didn't waste any time. The first steps were incredibly bold. Right after finishing the Reconquista, this centuries-long struggle to retake the Iberian Peninsula, they immediately went on the attack, capturing the city of Ceuta in North Africa. Then, guys like Prince Henry the Navigator, using amazing new tech like the Caravel ship, just pushed out into the unknown Atlantic, claiming islands like Madeira and the Azores. But the real game changer? It was psychological. In 1434, a guy named Julian sailed past Cape Bojador. Now, sailors at the time believed this was basically the edge of the world, a point of no return. But he went, and he came back. And just like that, a huge barrier of fear was shattered. So what was pushing them to do all this? In a word, money. Or more specifically, spices. See, back then, spices were like gold. But the overland trade routes to Asia were incredibly expensive and controlled by their rivals. The dream, the absolute obsession, was to find a direct sea route to India and the Spice Islands, cut out all the middlemen, and rake in the profits. As they made their way down the African coast, bit by bit, they set up trading posts. And at first, the trade was for things like gold, ivory, and local peppers. But pretty soon, it took a much, much darker turn. These early voyages were funded in part by the trade of enslaved Africans. And this was the very beginning of the horrific transatlantic slave trade. And this brings us to the empire's golden age. With the coast of Africa now being mapped, that ultimate prize, a direct sea route to India, was finally within reach. This next phase is where we see Portugal become the true masters of a brand new global trade network. But hold on. First, we need to talk about one of the wildest treaties in history. Just as Portugal was getting close to India, Christopher Columbus, who was sailing for Spain, bumped into the Americas. Now, to keep these two Catholic superpowers from going to war, the Pope stepped in. And the result was the Treaty of Tordesillas, an absolutely audacious plan to literally draw a line on the map and carve up the entire non-European world between the two of them. I mean, can you just imagine the sheer nerve? A line was drawn right down the Atlantic, everything to the west of the line, Spain's. Everything to the east, Portugal's. This basically handed Portugal control of Africa and the all-important sea route to Asia. But as we're about to see, that line had a very surprising and, you could say, accidental consequence for a massive piece of South America. So with the world neatly divided up, Vasco da Gama set sail in 1497, and his voyage was brutal. He lost half his ships, 2/3 of his crew died from scurvy. It was a disaster in human terms. But the tiny bit of spice cargo he managed to bring back sold for 60 times the cost of the entire expedition. 60 times! It was a mind-blowing success. It proved that a direct sea route to the riches of Asia wasn't just possible, it was insanely profitable. Okay, so just a year after Dama gets back, another huge expedition sets out for India. This one was led by a guy named Pedro Alvarez Cabral. But his fleet sailed, well, a little too far west in the Atlantic, and they bumped right into the coast of South America. They had accidentally discovered this massive landmass, which we now call Brazil, and thanks to that crazy Treaty of Tordesillas, it fell squarely inside Portugal's side of the line. Now, some historians think this accident wasn't so accidental. For a good long while, the Portuguese spice empire in Asia was an absolute cash cow. But, empires rise and they fall. Fierce competition from other European countries, especially the Dutch, plus a lot of costly wars, would eventually force Portugal to totally reinvent itself. They had to pivot their entire focus away from the east and towards their huge new territory in the west. The big turning point really came in 1580. Portugal had a succession crisis, no heir to the throne, so the King of Spain claimed the crown, uniting the two massive empires. This Iberian union turned out to be a complete disaster for Portugal. Why? Because all of Spain's enemies, like the super ambitious and sea-savvy Dutch and English, suddenly became Portugal's enemies too. And those enemies saw a golden opportunity. The Dutch, especially, went after Portugal's trading network like sharks. They systematically attacked and dismantled it piece by piece. Portugal lost its grip on the Indonesian spice trade, they lost key forts all across Asia, and valuable trading posts on the African coast. The Eastern Empire just started to crumble. So, as the Asian Empire was declining, the Portuguese threw everything they had into Brazil. First, they built up a hugely profitable sugar industry, but the real game changer was a massive gold rush that kicked off in 1693. By the middle of the 18th century, as you can see here, gold made up almost half of all of Brazil's exports, pouring unbelievable new wealth back into the empire. But we have to be crystal clear about where this wealth came from. It was built on the backs of enslaved people. Of all the millions of enslaved Africans who were forcibly brought to the Americas, a staggering 40% were sent to Brazil. This second life for the empire, this second fortune, was built on an absolutely unprecedented scale of human suffering. That wealth from Brazil, it gave the empire a second life for sure, but it couldn't stop the inevitable decline. The final act of the Portuguese Empire is this long, slow sunset, marked by disasters, revolutions, and the gradual letting go of its once massive global territory. I mean, look at this series of devastating blows. In 1755, a massive earthquake completely levels the capital, Lisbon. Then, in 1822, their economic engine Brazil declares independence, a huge loss. The 20th century saw them bleed money and lives in colonial wars in Africa, which were only stopped by a revolution back home in 1974. And then, the final symbolic chapter closed in 1999 when Macau was handed over to China. And just like that, the 500-year empire was officially over. Really, after losing Brazil, the empire was just a ghost of its former self. For another century and a half, it was mostly just an African empire, desperately trying to hold on to the last pieces of a global power that had faded a long, long time ago. And so, the empire ended. But its legacy, well, its legacy is all around us. The things this small nation did 500 years ago created connections and consequences that we still feel very powerfully today. One of the most obvious legacies? The language. Today, over 250 million people speak Portuguese. It's one of the most spoken languages on the entire planet. That's a living, breathing reminder of just how vast this empire's reach really was, from Brazil to Angola, all the way to Macau. And that brings us right back to where we started. Those daring voyages by Portuguese explorers 5 centuries ago didn't just find new lands. No, they laid the very foundation for the interconnected global economy we all live in today. The oceanic highways they charted are still carrying the world's commerce, a quiet, enduring testament to the ambition of the world's very first global empire.